Good afternoon. Welcome to our second panel titled Material Connections and Ruptures. Our IT team has done an excellent job. They're going to change each presentation, and then so the individual person can just hit the slide here to change each individual slide. We're going to go in the order on the panel. So first we'll hear from Dwight Carey with his paper titled The Commonality of Labor. We'll then hear from Nidhi Mahajan on this, from swamp to sea, and then finally Benedito Ferrão on escape artists, before then hearing from our discussant, Rachel Engmann, here at the Africa Institute. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dwight.
All right. So thank you for having me. And you can all hear me despite the mask, I guess. Maybe I'll stand up a little bit away from it. Okay. On the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius, a hillside fortress known as La Citadelle towers over the capital of Port Louis, with ramparts, a basalt exterior, offices, cannons, and panoramic views of the western Indian Ocean. This garrison that indentured laborers from India conceived in the 1840s testifies to the ability of such workers to meet the uniform standards of military construction in the 19th century. It is these construction dictates that perhaps indicate why a conventional approach to La Citadelle is unwarranted. Conventions often yield predictable outcomes. Yes, we could certainly try to examine colonial ground plans as well as the elements of style, design, and formalistic influence that have informed the construction of the space. Yes, we could even attempt to fit La Citadelle into the pantheon of British imperial forts that define colonial cities from East Africa to the Caribbean, or we could take a different path. This paper contends that La Citadelle can offer the discipline of architectural history and the field of Indian Ocean studies at large a vector for considering how to shift our focus on buildings and landscapes away from formalistic readings and toward a more socially engaged examination of architecture and social life in the past and present. A glance at La Citadelle reveals why this path forward is even possible. Like most structures on the island of Mauritius, La Citadelle is a place with a historical record that does not conform so neatly to the expectations of the formalist architectural historian. Few ground plans exist. The architects never left detailed notes on why they made their design choices, and we do not even have an extensive catalog of architectural drawings to guide an analysis of how the structure developed on paper. What we do have is a trove of information on labor costs, the composition of the workforce, and the reasons why authorities brought masons from India to raise this building in the first place. Such data presents us with an opportunity. With the aid of this information, we could render the study of this building the basis for a renewed understanding of architectural studies that positions Indian Ocean-built environments as the lodestars of a history of labor. This approach could consider how the experiences of workers in the past can guide us through the impasses that post-colonial nations like Mauritius face today. Mauritius is a particularly potent site for engaging this possibility. Today, La Citadelle stands atop a divided island with a population of 1.3 million inhabitants. Mauritians who are the descendants of indentured laborers who came to the island after slavery ended in 1839 constitute around 68% of the population. Descendants of enslaved people, white plantation owners, and Chinese immigrants each comprised 28%, 2%, and another 2% of the Mauritian public. As the two majority populations, descendants of Indian indentured laborers and descendants of the enslaved oftentimes find themselves at odds and in competition with one another. Likewise, the composition of parliament and the distribution of wealth oftentimes reflects the growing status of the island's Indian majority. The mixed-race descendants of enslaved people from across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean littoral are also the most impoverished class on the island. As a result, it can often seem as if Mauritius is a place where everything, even enduring histories, manifests the fact that descendants of the enslaved and descendants of the indentured are two diametrically opposed groups. Historical scholarship commonly supports this claim. Research on Mauritius has oftentimes characterized enslavement and indenture as two unrelated systems. Enslavement, the argument goes, was unlike indenture, a form of coerced work wherein individuals signed contracts that ratified their status and not the status of their children as forced laborers for fixed periods of time. The mostly Indian workers who came to Mauritius in the 19th and early 20th century were distinct from their formerly enslaved and emancipated counterparts, historians have argued. Since indentured people were servile laborers for set periods of time, their free children could apprentice them and use the skills they gained to achieve economic autonomy in Mauritius as the years progressed. Meanwhile, emancipated captives became a landed peasantry, and impoverishment followed them and their children. Over time, poverty became endemic among the people who were the descendants of these workers, the narrative goes. Such claims make historical sense of the ethnic and class divisions of contemporary Mauritius. In the 21st century, such arguments also bolster ethnic resentments by adding scholarly weight to the notion that the lived experiences of enslaved and indentured people were far from similar. Scholarship has a way of seeping into public discourse, and in the case of Mauritius, this tendency has made it seem as if one group was more privileged and the other was destined for failure. This paper contends that an examination of the living conditions of the forced laborers who came to Mauritius as La Citadelle emerged refutes these presumptions. I argue that an engagement of the experiences of enslaved and indentured people shows how building labor and the struggle to survive span societal divides. Not only did plans for the procurement of contracted masons from India germinate as early as the 18 teens when slavery still existed, but La Citadelle also came about as both enslaved and indentured workers toiled and subsisted under analogous conditions. Enslaved and indentured people lived in similar makeshift houses while working the same long hours and sleeping in cramped quarters. And as slavery ended, an indenture became the ruling regime of labor on Mauritius. Emancipated captives and newly arrived indentured laborers worked alongside one another. The result was the formation of a multicultural labor force whose experiences transcended ethnic or labor status distinctions. Quite uniquely, architectural studies can elucidate the enduring implications of this predicament by drawing attention to building labor. On an island where building construction played an outsized role in the formation of the British colony, an account of the working and living conditions of construction workers can reveal how enslavement and indenture engendered similar experiences and relied upon similar tactics of management and control. This point holds value for the study of Mauritius and the Indian Ocean world today because it can help us surmount the impasses that prevent communities of descendants from recognizing their shared historical trauma. Architectural history can subsequently move past its associations with tourism and connoisseurship, and in turn shape conversations about the historical meaning of building labor in multi-ethnic states. Since the Western Indian Ocean is home to many territories and nations where ethnic divisions continue to roil the political sphere, architectural studies can become a critical vector for encouraging discussions of how histories of labor transcend ethnic binaries. That is the value of La Citadelle for the field and the region at large. First, we must establish a timeline for the construction of the edifice itself. Crucially, our story begins in the era of transcultural slavery, when the island flourished as a trading post and had just begun to experiment with what would later become large-scale sugar production. The Indian convict laborers who came to the island when slavery was still legal were the predecessors of the workers who eventually raised La Citadelle. On December 2, 1815, Mauritius received some of its first Indian prisoners when 246 men landed on the island. Initially, their job was to break stones at local quarries and pave some of the roads of Port Louis. This arrangement, wherein convicts would come to Mauritius on limited-term work contracts that would end with their uncared-for freedom, prefigured the more formalized system of indentured labor that developed later in the 19th century. For the time being, Indian convicts had few rights, and most of them were eventually absorbed into the population of enslaved Creoles, since relationships between enslaved women and male prisoners became commonplace over the years. The men from Indian prisons who ended up on Mauritius were general recruits who did not have specific skills in carpentry or masonry. Most of them entered into the colonial prison system on the subcontinent as accused and convicted burglars, thieves, or recidivist offenders. Most of them were nonviolent, and all of them were people who had become known for good behavior while serving out their sentences in colonial jails. That made them ideal recruits for labor on Mauritius, officials reasoned. In this case, good behavior did not yield benefits of any sort. Good behavior simply got these captives to Mauritius, another site where life was tough and suffering endured. Commissioned to perform hard labor, convicts toiled under contracts that gave them the faint hope of attaining their freedom at some point. A free life on Mauritius then became an incentive to carry out work. It was all a mirage, however. Most prisoners never made their way out of a life of hardship. They went on to live in poverty after serving out sentences that amounted to years of breaking stones and paving roads. Brutalized and oftentimes injured by the work they undertook as convicts, these prisoners left their terms of employment with little money as well as chronic pain and none of the mercantile connections they needed to excel in their new home. Destitution rather than advancement became a fact of life. Years later, the onset of a full-fledged system of indentures struck Mauritius. In April of 1838, some of the first Mauritian indentured laborers landed on the island. They constituted a group of 70 artificers and 70 general laborers who had practiced masonry and carpentry in the Bombay Presidency of India. These laborers arrived to expediently begin work on La Citadelle, which their British colonial overlords called Fort Adelaide. Their arrival followed the landing of another 139 artificers from Bombay only months before. And by the time the bulk of the construction on the Citadel ended in 1841, hundreds of people from India had followed in their footsteps. And by 1861, Indian indentured laborers constituted 55% of the island's population of 180,823 people. After visiting several Mauritian construction sites and sugar plantations, one observer described the manipulative nature of the contracts these laborers signed. He noted that many of them, quote, have actually been kidnapped from their own country like enslaved people and induced to live under circumstances of gross fraud on Mauritius. Sold a lie, principally the idea that in Mauritius lay the keys to a better life, these laborers, quote, reached the colony after having been robbed 6 months' pay, he wrote. And once they settled in Mauritius, they worked for long hours, which rivaled those of enslaved people. Like enslaved and emancipated carpenters and masons, indentured laborers started work, quote, at sunrise, with the exception of a very limited breakfast, and generally continued without other intermission until dark, and often for several hours by moonlight, without sufficient time to eat their meals, the functionary observed. But their living conditions were the worst part of all. he contended. Quote, "In no instance have the Indians in Port Louis, so far as I have seen, anything but the bare floor provided for them. They are generally crowded together in places where respiration would be thought almost impossible in such a climate, and they are surrounded by filth." He even saw 2 estates, each belonging to landholders Mr. Berger and Mr. Lesueur, where the sleeping places for the indentured laborers were, quote, "over the stable of the mules, where there is an unaccompanied mass, an accumulated mass of filth of every description, from which the smell above was so offensive," end quote. In fact, the odor was so bad that this official could not remain in the sleeping loft for 5 minutes without suffering most disagreeably, he remembered. Whereas this colonial man could simply pick up and leave, the laborers he saw could not. They had to pick up with what their estate holders gave them. And when he asked Berger and Lesueur if they provided designated spaces for their laborers to rest, they responded with a resounding no. All of their workers had to sleep, quote, "in a stable or on the veranda during the night," they said. Given little food and hardly a place to rest, these laborers also had to contend with insufficient medical care. None of these workers ever made an official statement. Still in all, their experiences cry out from these pages and indicate just how much their lives mirrored those of enslaved Mauritians. In the years before slavery ended, La Jeunesse, a 35-year-old enslaved Sar from southern Mauritius who resided on a timber estate, told authorities that his owners forced him to work long hours with little food. For at least 3 weeks, La Jeunesse's overlords gave him the boiled roots of manioc, the same foodstuffs that they fed their pigs. Much like the indentured laborers who were forced to sleep with mules, La Jeunesse had to subsist on the same rations as swine. Enslaved and indentured laborers. In the juxtaposed accounts of La Jeunesse and the Observer of Indenture, 2 purportedly distinct groups who toiled under many of the same overseers stand together as a mass forced to live, work, and eat like animals on Mauritius. This point matters today within a Mauritian context wherein the government has decided to commemorate slavery and indenture in the form of 2 distinct museums. Apravasi Ghat, the repository that explores the history of indenture, and the Intercontinental Museum of Slavery, an institution that tells the story of Mauritian enslavement. So close, yet so far from one another, these 2 museums lie only 200 yards apart on the now refurbished wharf of Port Louis. Nevertheless, they have 2 distinct staffs, 2 distinct funding structures, and 2 distinct executive boards. Descendants of enslaved people comprise the majority of the professionals who work at the Slavery Museum, and descendants of the indenture dominate the staffing logs at Apravasi Ghat. With 2 collections and 2 distinct research agendas, Apravasi Ghat and the Intercontinental Museum of Slavery unsurprisingly convey 2 separate stories to the Mauritian public. It would be naive to think that architectural studies could bridge these divides, which reinforce the narrative that slavery and indenture were distinct histories with divergent implications for modern Mauritius. That said, architectural studies can still challenge the idea that slavery and indenture were always distinct in a divided society. Our scholarship could subsequently work against Mauritian ethnic divisions. Research into living and working conditions can reveal that enslavement and indenture were not irreconcilable histories forged by 2 populations with little in common other than the fact that they both called Mauritius home. Enslavement and indenture grew in concert with one another. The victims of these systems often applied the same skills and lived in the same squalid quarters. They lived and worked under similar conditions, and they suffered in much the same way. But above all, their labor tied them to a remote island that was far away from their homelands. Mauritius must have seemed like a hellish parallel universe to nearly all of them. No one can see another island from any point on Mauritius. all that you perceive when you stare into the sea from all sides of this island is a blue void. Escape must have seemed like a mere dream for most enslaved and indentured people who lived in stables alongside mules and who could only see a vast ocean before them when they went to work. At places like La Citadelle, everywhere they looked, they saw Mauritius, a land of hard labor. Geography reveals exactly what they were up against. The nearest island of Réunion is 135 miles to the southwest. The dependency of Rodrigue is 385 miles to the east. Madagascar is more than 400 miles to the west, and the Seychelles is around 1,000 miles to the north. The Comoros Islands are more than 1,000 miles away. These distances had a profound psychological impact on the laboring classes of 19th century Mauritius. Today, such geographies can also inform the field of Indian Ocean studies. For enslaved and indentured workers, distance made journeys across the sea and into neighboring island colonies harder and more painful. Mauritius became a new home because the prospect of traveling back to Africa or India or to a neighboring colony was often unviable. Distance also instilled distinct island cultures, while the small size and the remoteness of Mauritius pushed convicts, the enslaved, and indentured people into contact with one another. Oh, I just have one paragraph, sorry. They had no choice but to live together, sleep together, and communicate in ways that gave rise to the Mauritian Creole language. That is worth remembering in the divided Mauritius of the 21st century. It was also worth considering how the Indian Ocean geography once made Mauritius and many of its neighboring islands viable stopping points in the dangerous world of seafaring. What emerges from the study of these Indian Ocean landscapes is not a repeating island akin to what Antonio Benitez Rojo described when examining the Caribbean. Instead, the Indian Ocean was and is a waterscape of distant lands, a place where miles upon miles of ocean waters separate and demarcate locales where remoteness and smallness push diverse people together. Perhaps this predicament invites us to study these individual island worlds. Perhaps our approach should take on the tenor of a more localized examination. We could begin with the island itself, stay focused on that island when recounting Indian Ocean histories, and then branch out instead of embracing the tendency to always begin with a comparative approach. This means of studying the Indian Ocean could draw its inspiration from the endemic and individualized island landscapes of the region. The result could be a reimagined discipline that reveals the shared island experiences of residents, descendants, and ancestors, regardless of where they came from and regardless of their ethnic distinctions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'd really like to thank faculty and staff at the Africa Institute for organizing and for bringing us together. As a former fellow, it's really a joy to be back, so thank you. Thank you also to Laura and to Preeta for organizing this, for co-convening this conference, and for inviting to speak. The ideas I'm sharing here are an extension of an ongoing collaborative co-written project with Preeta Meyer and Kenny Coopers, who is not here. And I'm very grateful to both of them for thinking with me on this project. And some of the images that you'll be seeing in the slides are also part of a different project from an exhibition I co-curated with Mohamed Mchula at the Friends of Fort Jesus Museum, at the Fort Jesus Museum in Mombasa, in collaboration also with an organization called the Friends of Fort Jesus. So to begin, mangroves have long stirred colonial and post-colonial imaginations. In the Western colonial imaginary, mangroves have been sites of tropical pestilence, mosquito-infested pirate havens, unnavigable spaces in need of reordering, where assumptions of a binary between land and sea are thrown up in the air. Indeed, across the global south, mangrove swamps and forests were places of colonial reordering, especially through port making and land reclamation projects. But many of these projects were bound to fail, tides hungrily reclaiming land and turning it back into water. Mangroves therefore persistently defy fixity, and as such have become a symbol of the post-colonial condition. In the Caribbean literary and scholarly imagination, mangroves have been used to mobilize the tangled histories of the region to reimagine political belonging in the present. From Derek Walcott to Aimé Césaire, the mangrove has been a poetic metaphor for the post-colonial Caribbean. So famously, for Glissant, the mangrove is a crucial figure in reimagining a post-colonial Caribbean identity. He states famously, submarine roots, that is free-floating, not fixed in one position in some primordial spot, but extending in all directions in our world through its network of branches. The mangrove has been understood to be a uniquely Caribbean rhizome to theorize the past and the present. So what would it mean to think with the mangrove in the Indian Ocean, especially from archipelagic East Africa, where the mangrove has been a resource harnessed for long-distance trade? Mangrove poles harvested in the Lamu archipelago in Kenya and the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania have been used for building material across the Middle East and East Africa for millennia. While coral and stone architecture used in merchant homes across the region have been central to an Indian Ocean aesthetic visible in heritage projects even here in the U.A.E., these buildings were historically built using mangrove poles as structural timber. What then would it mean to move beyond the aesthetics of these heritage projects to trace mangrove poles as material objects through which to reimagine political belonging? Focusing on the trade in mangrove poles from Lamu, Kenya, I analyze how this trade has been and continues to be a flashpoint for the making of space and identity in the Indian Ocean. In the Lamu archipelago, the trade in mangrove poles has been mired in rumors and political intrigue. Although the export of mangrove poles from Kenya was banned in the 1980s, in the past 10 years, the ban in the trade has again resurfaced in contestations between residents of Lamu and the Kenyan state, even as it seeks to build a large mega port in Lamu. By focusing on mangrove poles, I draw attention then to the lesser-known material histories of these Indian Ocean aesthetics and connectivity that offers a glimpse into how mangroves allow or might be an entry point into thinking of a reconfiguring of identity in the Lamu archipelago. So just some background on Lamu. The Lamu archipelago is vast and diverse, comprising of a series of mainland settlements such as Vitu and Impeketoni, and over 50 islands, including Kiwayu, Indao, Pate, Manda, and Lamu itself, which feature as some of the oldest urban settlements in the Eastern African littoral. Lamu County is also home to diverse communities, some of whom self-identify as indigenous, including Swahili, Bajun, Boni, and Oroma. These ethnic identities are in flux and historically contingent. However, in the context of post-colonial citizenship rights in Kenya, a person must have one clearly bounded ethnic or tribal identity, no matter how provisional. The boundaries between the Swahili and the Bajuni are particularly contested, as some claim that the Bajuni are the so-called low-ranking or a branch of the Swahili. So I offer this background to kind of think through how Lamu has been a key node of trans-regional trade and production. As a terra-aqueous region with over 65,000 hectares of mangrove forests, and as a littoral society, Lamu's economy has historically relied on this complex interaction between land and sea, mangrove poles that flourish only through the particular meeting of land and sea being harvested and sent across the ocean to the timber-hungry Middle East. This trade in mangrove poles has historically formed the backbone of Lamu's economy and importance as a port city. The stone town of Lamu, the main town in the archipelago, with known elite, typically elite coral and stone architecture that Preeta Meyer has written about, was built actually using mangrove poles as structural timber. The town was granted UNESCO World Heritage status in 2001, these former merchant homes becoming crucial for Lamu's tourist industry as they were transformed into hotels. Indian Ocean aesthetics of the stone house, the dhow, which was also in Lamu, built using mangrove poles, And this typical maritime orientation of Lamu has attracted tourists from across the world. Yet, Lamu is currently being made anew. Construction is currently underway for a multi-million-dollar port and transportation facility known as the Lamu Port and Lamu Southern Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, or LAPSET. The project, inaugurated in 2012, aims to create a trans-African transport and logistics network that includes dozens of massive tanker berths, highways, oil pipelines, railways, resort cities, airports, and a fiber optic cable. Lamu is projected to become the Indian Ocean terminus for a rail land bridge that would eventually traverse the entire breadth of the continent. For the Kenyan government, LAPSET is a nation-building project that would transform Lamu into the, and they call it this, the Dubai of Africa, ensuring the future of Kenya as a globally relevant nation-state. Yet the project has become a flashpoint for competing visions of the region's past, present, and future. China is building the new port as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, a controversial global infrastructure and finance program. Investors and the Chinese government have touted the project as a transformative South-South collaboration that would inaugurate a new era of prosperity by boosting international trade and industry at an unprecedented scale. All of this to say that the residents of Lamu, however, have been opposed to the project, arguing that it is a neo-colonialist, capitalist-driven folly, a manifestation of the Kenyan state's extractivist grip on a region that has already been grappling with a high unemployment rate, ruinous public works, environmental degradation, and increased land grabbing. While mangrove preservation has been a focal point of environmental concerns around the project, the trade in mangrove poles, interestingly enough, became a flashpoint around which some of these tensions and resistance to the project arose. Indeed, to trace the rise and fall of the mangrove pole trade in Lamu is to track its relationship to the central government of Kenya, not only in the present, but also in the past, but to kind of move to the past a little bit. Again, homes across the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula were once made using mangrove poles from East Africa. The dimensions of rooms and houses, now associated with an Indian Ocean aesthetic, were dependent on the length of mangrove poles harvested from East Africa. The mangrove pole has thus long connected Lamu to overseas consumers, perhaps from the beginnings of Indian Ocean trade. Growing on the islands that surround Lamu County, as well as the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania, Rhizophore macronato, or cocoa mangrove, was exported for use as structural timber and building materials for thatching, firewood, as well as to make charcoal. This trade enriched the freeborn elite and the powerful merchants of Lamu town, but an entire industry and labor system developed around mangrove production. It required craft specialization and harvesting expertise. Enslaved and free people worked as mangrove cutters, as sailors navigating the jahazis used to transport the poles, as well as shipbuilders and porters. Sailors and merchants from overseas also regularly came to Lamu town up until the 1980s to buy mangrove and other commodities, including ivory, cotton, coconut oil, and so on. Mercantile architecture and trade infrastructure defined Lamu town's waterfront for centuries. Owing to a large demand for timber in the Middle East and Gulf, this trade in mangrove poles became particularly important in the 20th century, especially during World War I and World War II. Lamu became renowned for its quality of boritis, which was the standard pole exported, pictured here, as well as the skill of its cutters in selectively harvesting straight poles that were suitable for building. The fortunes of many Lamu families came to depend on mangroves. The long fingers of the trade stretched into every island in the archipelago, each one serving a unique function. While the island of Ndau, owing to its proximity to the forest itself, became known for its skilled, largely Bajuni mangrove cutters, the town of Matandoni became the center of the jahazi building industry, the boats used to navigate the thick mangrove forests being built on its shores. Merchant families and shipping agents, typically Swahilis, Hadramis, and South Asians who traded in these poles, lived in the town of Lamu, the rhythms of life in town shifting with the monsoon, as dhows would arrive from elsewhere in December and depart by April. From April to December, preparations for the next season would begin. Mangrove cutters, typically Bajunis, would be out in the forest for a week at a stretch harvesting poles, and these mangroves were then stored in stacks or corrijas along the waterfront in anticipation for the arrival of dhows. But dhows from the Indian Ocean no longer call at Lamu, the export trade having come to an end in the 1980s. Many residents of Lamu believed that the trade died a slow death through several government policies that sought to control the trade. In February 1978, the export of mangrove poles was banned by the Forest Department, the orders for the ban originating in President Jomo Kenyatta's office. The circumstances surrounding the ban were shrouded in mystery, rumors abounding about the ban and its logics. The ban was lifted in 1981, but then reinstated in 1982, the government once again citing concerns about mangrove conservation. However, Lamu's mangrove pole cutters, businessmen, local scholars, and even environmental activists argued that the local knowledge of mangrove forests was more effective in conservation than government rules. They insisted that mangrove forests needed to be pruned, the cutting of old tall poles, allowing for the regeneration and growth of new ones. The local practice of harvesting was a selective one, poles being cut based on the length and the straightness of the pole, and there being no wide-scale harvesting. Instead, the forest was divided into quarters, only certain areas being harvested in a particular year and then being allowed to regenerate. Government claims that the forests were being overcut were widely dismissed by people of Lamu itself. Many questioned the authority of the officials who made these rules, arguing that most government officials did not hail from Lamu itself and were not familiar with the unique sort of landscape or seascape. Yet others believed that the ban was a more sinister move by the government to impoverish Lamu. Sheikh Abdul Qadir, an elderly, well-respected imam and poet in Lamu, once succinctly put what many others had told me about the ban. The sheikh said, "Many people say that the ban was a plan to kill the coast economically. It was planned by upcountry people to finish the coastal area so that we depend on them for everything." The sheikh's comments were building upon tensions between Lamu and widely coastal Kenya and the central government ever since the coast's incorporation into Kenya in 1963. Still others believed that the ban was not directed at mangrove poles per se, but a shadow economy that went alongside this business. Mangroves were the reason dhows from abroad came to Lamu, but not the business. Mohammed, a former coxswain, whispered to me one afternoon in 2012. He explained to me while the dhows that once came from the Middle East did so for timber, real profits for sailors and cutters lay in magendo, or the contraband trade in ivory, rhino horns, and leopard skins. Mohammed even believed that the ban on the export of mangrove poles was part of a larger national and international effort to put an end to the illegal trade in ivory, the government being aware of the links between the two. Former sailors who transported mangroves and contraband explained that there was not much profit in simply transporting mangrove poles, and in order to have enough cash flow to buy the goods of the Middle East and India that were so much in demand in East Africa, like coffee jugs, dates, perfumes, and so on, they needed to smuggle high-priced luxury goods like ivory, rhino horns, and so on. And this is where they stood to earn profits. Mohammed argued that this contraband trade reflected broader trends under the Kenyatta government, from independence until 1978. He argued that Jomo Kenyatta's own family was involved in the ivory trade, although through a different network that did not go through Lamu or its maritime connections. Kenyatta's wife, popularly known as Mama Ngina, was heavily involved in ivory smuggling herself, although she used airplanes to transport the ivory rather than dhows or ships. President Moi, along with Richard Leakey, in this kind of cheeky picture, who was the director of the Kenya Wildlife Service, cracked down on poaching and ivory smuggling, most famously setting fire to a 20-foot pile of illegal ivory in 1989. The ban on mangrove pole trades was thus seen as one way to bring an end to the contraband trade in ivory. Yet, the ban was a selective one. The harvesting and sale of mangrove poles was permitted for the domestic market through the issuance of special permits. Much of this was to allow for repairs to the many stone houses and other buildings that gave Lamu its UNESCO World Heritage status. And mangroves thus continue to be a part of this heritage. Abdul Rahman Aboud, one of these mangrove pole dealers, emphasized the importance of mangrove poles for Lamu. He said to me, and he said this to me repeatedly, Lamu cannot be Lamu without mangrove poles. Yet LAPSET, the new port project, has necessitated a widespread destruction of mangroves as it is built around and on mangrove forests. Even as Lamu residents challenge the building and expansion of this port, many of them now couch their arguments in the need to protect the built environment and ecology of Lamu. In addition, many of Lamu's residents who were once employed in the mangrove pole trade have also couched the need to protect mangroves and reignited debates around the ban in mangrove pole trade by tying it to ethnic identity, especially for the Bajuni residents of archipelagic Lamu. For folks like Abdul Rahman, Lamu's identity is tied to mangroves not only for their ecological importance, but also as they are tied to notions of a Bajuni identity. Bajuni communities have sought to counter state power by harnessing the language of archipelagic indigeneity, which is also a highly contested process because it is anchored in competing interpretations of heritage and belonging. Notions of a Bajuni archipelagic identity have resurfaced in the face of LAPSET. For example, Omar, a young Bajuni activist from Lamu, whose family were once mangrove pole cutters and who was now chair of an organization called the Hidabu Self-Help Group, channeled ideas of Bajuni indigeneity. His group was trying to return Hidabu Hill, a plot of land in Lamu, to indigenous people and halt its settlement by people from mainland Kenya or upcountry for the LAPSET project. Hidabu Hill, claimed Omar, was one of the original settlements in the Lamu area, and as such, Bajunis from the archipelago, rather than Kikuyus from the interior, should enjoy entitlements. And I mean, there's this picture of these stones because he would continually point at this former, heritage and point at the stones as evidence of this heritage. Many families once employed in the mangrove pole trade and now facing land dispossession have thus contested LAPSET by using the language of indigeneity to anchor their claims. Yet for many residents of Lamu, these narratives of indigeneity require a reframing of their historical status in Kenya. The Bajuni are not a cohesive endogamous group. Indeed, at various points, they have fallen under the loose category of the Swahili, even though unlike the Swahili, they were considered native in the colonial legal categorizations of native and non-native in Kenya. As civil society organizations in Lamu, such as the Hidabu Self-Help Group, now couch their claims to land based on collective Bajuni ownership, claim making in the wake of LAPSET threatens to harden the category of the Bajuni. Yet there is also political value in the resurgence of this category of identification. To be Bajuni, a category that is understood to be native in sort of the legal history of native and non-native status, has led to claims of indigeneity that are recognizable in the eyes of the Kenyan state. Yet it is here that the metaphor and the materiality of mangroves is once again useful. Scholarship on the Caribbean has suggested that the mangrove has been, and I'm quoting David Bond here, a vital life force still outside the modular purview of modern purpose. As such, these unbowed forests are uniquely suited to voicing critiques of modernist orderings of people and landscapes. Indeed, environmental actions couched in the need for the protection of mangroves have enabled the closure of oil refineries across the Caribbean. Defying notions of singularity, fixity, and territoriality, mangroves have been viewed as an ecological symbol of creolization, notions of purity, rootedness, and singularity being undone by a plant that grows not on land, not in salt or fresh water, nor simply in rivers or in the sea, but in the interstitial tidal spaces where all of these elements meet and yet defy rootedness, as mangroves often grow with their roots in the air, dropped leaves becoming fertilizer for continual growth, mangroves regenerating themselves. In the Lamu archipelago, a region shaped by mangroves and a trade in poles, a resurgence of Bajuni archipelagic identity, once materially tied to mangroves, has led to a rebellious vision of Lamu, the mangrove once again becoming a rhizome through which to imagine political belonging. In some moments, this rhizome reaches outward towards the sea and the sky, and in others, it roots into the land. And I'm just going to end here. Thank you.
Masal Khair. Thank you very much to Preeta and Laura and the staff at Africa Institute for organizing this conference. The stage is set for another exit, a recurrent theme in Vamona, Anantha Sinai Navelcar's life. As the Goan artist packs up everything of significance, there's a palpable sense of something ominous to come. In this striking moment in the 2013 biography, Vamona Navelcar, an artist of 3 continents, Anne Ketteringham chronicles that her subject collected all his belongings, including 950 drawings and sketches, 60 oil paintings, and placed them in a suitcase ready to leave Mozambique. Released in 1976, after serving 3 months in a hard labor camp, Navelcar no longer wished to stay in Mozambique after the torment and indignity of imprisonment. Indeed, he could not stay on in the newly independent country because he was a citizen of Portugal, Mozambique's former colonizer. His imprisonment darkened what had been one of the happiest times in his life. His destination was once again the country of his citizenship, a nation he had been forced to leave a decade and a half ago because of the end of Portuguese colonialism in his own native Goa. Navelcar's journey by air from Maputo to Lisbon circuitously included Beira, Dar es Salaam, and Nairobi. Finally, after Frankfurt and Barcelona, Navelcar arrived in Lisbon in early February 1976. A veritable cartography of empire past, the convoluted itinerary had been the result of political instability in the aftermath of Mozambique's independence. In other words, the link between colony and metropole had been snapped. Informed by a set of pictures captured by Mozambican photographer Ricardo Rangel in 1975 of Retornados and their things, Pamela Gupta, who is here, movingly remarks of these images by Navelcar's contemporary that Rangel's images remind me that colonialism is first and foremost an act of possession, and its undoing one of dispossession. Dubbed retornados, Portuguese for returnees, like Navelcar, for many of these Portuguese citizens in Rangel's photographs, Portugal had not been home for a long time, and in some cases, not the country of their birth. Unlike Navelcar, most of the retornados were white. Disembarking in the cold, Navelcar was to find that even Portugal, like its former African dominion, was in distress. It was 2 years after the Carnation Revolution of 1974. At the same time as its African empire was collapsing, Portugal itself was in a state of disrepair. And then, against this backdrop of state failure, that fateful thing happened. Navelcar was to discover that the suitcase with which he had departed Mozambique had gone missing. With it were lost nearly 1,000 pieces of his art. The suitcase was never to be recovered. Having previously curated a retrospective of Navelcar's art, co-written a political biography, and a graphic novella about him, my presentation today attempts to look at Navelcar's legacy differently than I have in the past. Relying on Navelcar's itinerary from the Indian Ocean post-colonial nation of Mozambique to the formerly colonial Portugal on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean as a metaphor, I aim to trace an interoceanic and transcontinental trajectory of cultural, political, and historical influence in the mid to late 20th century that is peculiarly lusospheric. The lusosphere, as I evoke that term, pertains to Portugal and its far-flung and geographically disconnected colonies, distances mitigated far less by colonial control than by the movements of colonized subjects. What might it mean to look at a former colonizing state in the Atlantic Ocean world from the vantage point of Indian Oceanic Africa and Goa? Even as the connections between oceanic realms have been the object of recent study, they often take as their period the slave trading era of modernity. As Stuart McManus observes in a 2021 article, the connected and comparative history of Atlantic and Indian Ocean slavery is still in its infancy. This notion is borne out in Richard Allen's examination in 2008 of the historiography of Indian Ocean slavery to raise questions about how we view the relationship between the worlds of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic during the 18th and 19th centuries. Jay Bohorquez, in an article from 2020, traces early modern circuits of trade in enslaved people, fabric, and other goods that covered Portuguese Africa, the French Mascarenes, and Brazil. That the traders involved in these pursuits were not just the Portuguese, but also South Asians, demonstrates the under-examined complexities of interoceanic exchanges. It is notable that this interoceanic historiography relates to the lives and canvases of other artists of Goan origin, including the Lisbon-based Karishma de Souza. A portrait of the metropole, Routing 1, colors post-colonial Lisbon, denoted by its quintessential steps, with Saharan sands that sweep into the city from across the Atlantic. Blown in by winds that billowed the sails of early modern vessels of conquest, the sand is a gritty reminder of Portugal's colonial entanglement with Africa. Also visible on the canvas is the verdant presence of flora that traveled with people on the Indian Oceanic trade routes, symbolic of contemporary cultural influence from Portugal's elsewheres. Moving from the colonial to the anti-colonial and post-colonial periods, interoceanic histories between the Indian and Atlantic worlds represent a largely uncharted terrain. This includes the triangulation between colonial Europe and Afro-Asia's decolonial politics, especially the seemingly obvious history of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung era circa the 1950s. What is often not contended with is the lusospheric specificity of that moment. Consider that Navelcar's native Goa was rid of Portuguese colonialism in part because of a call to action by Portuguese Africa. In 1947, India became independent of the British Empire, while Goa, which had been conquered by Portugal in 1510, continued to be a Portuguese overseas territory for 4.5 centuries. Raghuram Trichur observes that anti-colonial leaders in Africa took independent India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru's inaction on Goa as a sign of weakness. They equated India's unwillingness to intervene against the Portuguese in Goa to abetting Portuguese repression in Africa. In a 2-day war in 1961, India ousted the Portuguese from Goa. That same year, Angola began its war to gain freedom from the Portuguese, and shortly thereafter, Portugal's other African territories, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, followed suit. Even as the contagion of anti-coloniality spread across the international community, the effect on Goans themselves was less than decisively joyous. Because the rest of the Indian nation-state was decolonized in 1947 and was consequently an independent and sovereign nation, any action to liberate Goa, which was still an extension of the Portuguese state, would be tantamount to an act of foreign aggression. Writing in 2011 on the 50th anniversary of the so-called liberation of Goa, Vivek Menezes describes the Indian action of 1961 as a humiliating military occupation in the wake of annexation, which continued the colonial experience of being ruled from a distant center, with local interests and concerns marginalized to favor those of the conqueror. Famously, following its own path to freedom from the British through non-violence, post-British India's violent takeover of Goa circumvented the self-emancipatory efforts of Goans themselves. It was not only in Goa that the deleterious effects of the annexation were felt by Goans, including Navelcar. In the 1950s, when he was in his 20s, the artist's talent was beginning to garner attention. A portrait he was commissioned to draw of the Portuguese Prime Minister António de Oliveira Salazar was dispatched to Lisbon. Within a few weeks, in a propagandist move, the Prime Minister himself bestowed upon Navelcar a scholarship to study art in the metropole. In an interview with Margaret Mascarenhas, Navelcar recalled how the Indian takeover of Goa in 1961 resulted in his being blacklisted. Xavier Viegas, who also interviewed Navelcar about the episode, further details that a fellow Goan named Antonio Fonseca demanded that the artist signed a document decrying Jawaharlal Nehru as an aggressor and Goans as victims of his tyranny. Navelcar shrugged off involvement, saying, "I am a painter." While Navelcar claims political apathy here, preferring instead to align himself with the realm of his talent, the patronage under which the artist came to his education, and thereupon the repeated troubles in the different continents he called home, suggests the artist's life and artistry has never been divorced from the political. The politically motivated blacklisting proved such a detriment to Navelcar in Portugal that he was forced to seek employment on another continent. While he returned to the Indian Ocean, it was not Goa that received the artist in 1963, but Mozambique, which was then still a colony of Portugal. Having been born in Portuguese India, Navelcar was a naturalized citizen of Portugal, a distinct but not unproblematic quality of Portuguese colonialism in comparison to its British counterpart. It might be conjectured that Navelcar chose Mozambique over Goa precisely because the former was still Portuguese and the artist could work there as a citizen of Portugal. Returning to Goa so closely upon its takeover by India might have complicated matters for the artists, as resident Goans summarily lost their European citizenship as a result of the Indian annexation. The end of Portuguese colonialism in Goa, which had haunted Navelcar in Lisbon, should have served as an omen for things to come on the other side of the Indian Ocean. In 1975, Mozambique declared its independence from Portugal, and, as Navelcar recounted for Mascarenhas, it was clear that the Portuguese would have to leave, and that included myself. If heretofore it had been the prospect and processes of Indian Ocean decolonialism that had provided opportunity for the artist and caused him hardship, it would be the politics of post-colonialism that came to play a role in the Mozambican chapter of Navelcar's life. In 1975, the year that Mozambique gained its independence from the Portuguese, Navelcar lost his freedom. The reasons remain unclear as to why the artist and his students were rounded up and sent off to a hard labor camp in distant Himala for 3 months. Yet, this was not an aberration in how Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, or Frelimo, dealt with the transition to post-colonialism. Victor Igreja portrays Frelimo's post-independence authoritarianism as violence used in the service of establishing a discontinuity with the colonial regime by eradicating alleged enemies from society and imposing a national revolutionary consciousness. Beholden to a promise he made to the parents of his students to keep their children safe from harm while they were imprisoned, Navelcar devised a plan reminiscent of 1001 Nights. Navelcar requested permission from the commander in charge of the camp for him and his students to paint the walls of the compound with an image depicting the freedom struggle of the African people. The mural was to be called Freedom of Africa, but it was never completed. Every day, like Scheherazade, Navelcar devised new ways to delay the completion of the story the mural would tell by drawing very slowly and telling the students to take their time to complete the work. In this way, Navelcar managed to keep his students from having to do hard labor in the Mozambican jungle, where inmates and escapees died from being mauled by wild animals. Despite his statements to the contrary, what Freedom of Africa, Navelcar's unfinishable mural, shows is that his artistic oeuvre and history is decidedly political. The irony of the painting's title, Freedom of Africa, is twofold. Firstly, for its creation in a place of unfreedom, and secondly, for its subtle critique of the newly independent nation that freed itself from colonialism only to take away the freedom of its own people. While in Lisbon, at the time of the handover of Goa between Portugal and India, Navelcar actively distanced himself from political involvement. In Portuguese Mozambique, his adopted home, the artist covertly lent his artistic talents to anti-colonial efforts. In response to requests for art to accompany protest posters against colonial rule, Navelcar acquiesced and took pains to avoid detection by the Portuguese authorities. Ketteringham, his biographer, quotes Navelcar as saying, "I used to paint and draw with my left hand so that people would not recognize my style." At the end of his incarceration, Navelcar journeyed from post-colonial Mozambique to post-Carnation Revolution Portugal, his suitcase full of the works he had created in once Portuguese Africa disappearing somewhere en route. Antonio Tomás recharacterizes the Carnation Revolution and its association with freedom in Africa by noticing that the official history of this period purports that the end of the Estado Novo, or the dictatorial regime, opened the way for the decolonization of Lusophone Africa. In fact, what has been overlooked is that the Carnation Revolution does not only follow the 1973 Guinea-Bissau Revolution chronologically, but it was for the most part produced by it. Tomás emphasizes that the charismatic leader of the nationalist movement in Guinea-Bissau, Amílcar Cabral, was aware that the independence of the countries he was fighting for, Guinea and Cabo Verde, would only take place after the demise of the Estado Novo. He believed that the struggle to end colonialism in those lands and fascism in Portugal was the same. Concomitant upon the revolutionary political changes in Portuguese Africa that communicated themselves to the metropole, the legacy of Portugal's dominions in Africa, which came to an end at the same time as the authoritarian Estado Novo, would interpolate itself into post-colonial Portugal with retornados like Navelcar. As Gupta chronicles, the retornados were a constant reminder of the experience of trauma, loss, and messiness of decolonization that had taken place across 2 continents. With his return to Lisbon, Navelcar had brought back a personal history that included Goa and Mozambique. And while he no longer had the canvases from his African stint, that he continued until his death in 2021 to create art with Mozambican influences indicates the perpetuity of the legacy he participated in and was shaped by. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so thank you everyone. So as an archaeologist working in the Atlantic Ocean, I've wanted for some time the opportunity to engage in dialogue with scholars working in the Indian Ocean, to learn and to better understand global historical connections, exchange networks, imperial and colonial encounters, environmental and ecological perspectives, and also how to write about these histories and afterlives. And I just want to say that your writing and your presentations are beautiful. These papers have been incredibly enlightening, so a big thank you to Dwight, Nidhi, Benedito for sharing your work, to the conference organizers and to everyone here today. After listening to 3 exceptional papers, it's evident that the complexities of the Indian Ocean's material histories are far from straightforward. In my reading of these 3 very diverse presentations, a notable theme that emerges is one of the intricate matter of material entanglements. I'm thinking more specifically to theories of entanglements that people that work with stuff, as we all do, like. In particular, materiality and the relationship between people and things. In different ways, Dwight, Nidhi, and Benedito highlight the ways in which the material world exerts agency in historical, political, and social interactions, as well as cultural practices. In other words, things, through their production, consumption, and circulation, play an active role in shaping human behavior and societal organization, embodying social meanings and the dynamics of power, often over time. As these scholars have shown, fortresses that once conscripted, enslaved, and indentured labor to construct them have today also become central to discussions over the commemoration of slavery amongst various descendant communities. Mangrove poles lie firmly situated within the colonial and post-colonial imaginaries. They enriched freeborn elites and powerful merchants using enslaved and freeborn people in the past, but in the present are situated in contestations over land and belonging between the Kenyan state and Bantu communities. Art, including its making, support, and sponsorship as a form of soft power that Portugal employs to demonstrate its cultural connections to Goa. Art plays a role in critiquing colonialism and anti-colonial efforts, so much so an artist can end up incarcerated. But I want to shift my discussion from the communities in which we work, and I have two ways of asking the questions, to ask about our own, or your own entanglements. So my question for the panel, and I have one question for everyone on the panel then, and I have a lot of questions, but maybe after that I'll just ask you each one. So my question for the panel is, how can architectural historians, anthropologists, and literary people adopt a reflexive approach, acknowledging our own entanglements with the objects we study? And what would such an approach, one that considers our own positionality and biases, look like? So, should we do that one and then we'll cover it? Okay.
Should I go first? Or Dwight, do you want to?
So I think, that's an interesting question. How can we acknowledge our own entanglements to these various issues? I mean, I think that with the issue of history writing in a place like Mauritius, I think it's twofold. I think it's about recognizing how you, the individual, the historian, relates to this particular place and why. This is particularly salient for me because, I'm not, one of the most common questions I get is, oh, are you from Mauritius, right? And the answer is no, I'm not. I'm African American, and so I am a descendant of slaves myself, but then the question is, well, why are you then studying a place like Mauritius? And so I think that it's about acknowledging that, yes, I am an outsider, but then at the same time, I think that you can see resonances with the American context or with the Atlantic context in this Mauritian case, in particular, this notion of a divided society, right? Ethnic rivalries coming into play. even just the reality that the government commemorates different histories literally in different physical spaces that are, yes, close to one another, but separate. Not just in terms of the building, but also funding structures and everything else. And so I think that, even though I'm saying that, yes, we might want to think about this island-centered approach, I think it's also about recognizing that, well, as scholars, we are transcending this, but then effectively we can learn to think about how, how our particular island-centered approach can be linked to the work of others. So I think by talking about Mauritius in these forums, that's the way that we can think about creating this notion of a broader perspective beyond this particular island. But I think it's also something that I thought about when looking at when thinking about the other presentations earlier today, the reality that, yes, we can talk about transnationalism and movement across borders, but the reality is that a lot of the people who we study, right, indentured laborers, enslaved people, many of them were not able to leave places like Mauritius. And even today, right, a lot of people in Mauritius aren't able to travel because it's so expensive to go anywhere else. So I think it's about acknowledging our position as these privileged scholars, but also recognizing that there are resonancies between our own ethnic or cultural situations and those of this place. So hopefully.
Thanks for the question, Rachel, and also for the wonderful summation. As a diasporic person who returned to the homeland, I think one of the things that you often feel is that you're out of place, and you're made to feel out of place, and you constantly get told that you don't know yourself because you've not sort of grown up in this context, right? And so you find other people around the same age as you, and you create community with them. I had the great honor of meeting Vamona when he was 87 years old, and he had the same story as me. He was out of place at the age of 87 and made that productive, right? So he was an insider-outsider. And I was like, if this old man can still claim this, right? It was so remarkable to me that he knew exactly what he was and what he wasn't, and used his art to depict it. And that resonates for me in the work that I do in exploring connections between Asia, Africa, and the West in my literary criticism, recently now turning to art history as well. Vamona's work literally and artistically sort of, illustrated these dissociations and associations at the same time, where very often Goan people could be part of the comprador class, right? And at other times could be the victims of the system, and sometimes might have been both. And here was Vamona who, in many ways, had privilege, lost it, regained it. It was never a fixed story for him, so yeah. So it's not just his art, it's his life as well. That's illustrative, yeah.
Thank you. I think both of your comments, and thank you, Rachel, for, that really sort of, you really pulled the three pieces together, so thank you for that, and for this great question. But just going back to also both of your comments on this insider-outsider dynamic, right? I think we're all seeing it in different forms. I mean, I'm not Kenyan, but like doing this work in Kenya, where I started, for my dissertation, and the port was just being built in Lamu at the time. And it was really interesting to think of the outsider piece of it, right? Because insider in terms of being from the Indian Ocean, right? Because that was also an imaginary. I grew up in Bombay, and when I would tell people this in Lamu, they knew exactly what I was talking about. There was an imagination of what that other place was and how I fit in Lamu itself. Suddenly, every Bajuni activist I spoke to ended up having like an Indian grandfather or Indian grandmother, right? Those stories just started coming out that were unpacking also that neat Bajuni identity that they were kind of, using to push back against the state. But it was also made possible, I think, in the conversations around being an outsider and who is an insider or an outsider in the Indian Ocean. And this is something that, these folks have been grappling with for a long time as well, because so many of these ideas of indigeneity are all sort of going back to who was here first, right? Which is, again, very contested in Kenya and in other places in the Indian Ocean. But in terms of also what does that do for, the writing of the work, right? And I mean, we see it play out definitely in ethnographic work as well as in other kind of places, but how does one actually write about it, right? Without making it about yourself, and that is a continual sort of, I think, a back and forth. But yeah, I'm not quite sure, but I think there is a way in which longer projects can allow for that, but at the same time have a critical sort of understanding of what you are able to, what your work is able to show and what it also silences, right? Depending on who you're talking to and how they view you. But I think this question of insider, outsider in the Indian Ocean can be so contested. Like, who is an insider? Nobody. Who is an outsider? Everybody. Or you can flip it around as well. There's often switch. Exactly. It's pretty switchy.
There's often many ways in which one can be at once, as you said, like, there are many ways to be inside and outside. It's not so straightforward. So, okay, so I have lots of questions, but I don't want to take up so much time, so I'll ask you all just one question, if you don't mind. So yes, maybe, Dwight, you addressed this in your paper, and I'm just thinking, it might be of use, it might not, but oftentimes Africanists will stay away from the term slavery when they're talking about slavery in Africa, and use local terms, because in a way that gives them time, or allows them the space to talk about the specific historical, legal, all these other important ways of thinking about the status, the privilege, rather than slavery. So I wonder, what is the term for an enslaved person in Mauritius? Because I think that, in a way you have this huge spectrum of bondage, which includes enslavement, servitude, and other forms of, dependency and oppression. And I think that maybe that is a productive way, given your project, to examine indentured work laborers and enslaved people.
So in Mauritius, it's a place where people speak French, English, and Mauritian Creole. And so
Okay.
Sorry. So basically, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So basically, the languages that people speak in Mauritius are most Mauritian Creole, of course, and also French and English. Mauritian Creole is the local language. Generally, if you go into, the language of the University of Mauritius is English, but if you go into, say, government offices or the National Heritage Foundation or something like that, people tend to speak French, but Mauritian Creole and French are very closely related languages, so you can begin speaking in French and then switch into Mauritian Creole and then switch back. Generally, the words that people use to describe enslavement is l'esclavage, which is the French word for slavery. Indenture is l'engagement, or indentured people would be les engagés. And, in Mauritius, generally, what I found when people use the word when they're talking about enslaved people, they say les esclaves. So, it translates pretty directly into what we would say in English. But the thing is that I think that at least locally, the words that people tend to use tend to reflect these very, the reality that Mauritius is a place that has, in a lot of ways, tried in the post-colonial era to position itself as very different from, say, a lot of its neighboring societies, while looking to Europe for inspiration, but also even more recently towards India. And so I think that it's true that there is a local understanding of enslavement as being something that was impressed upon the society, but also I think that in a certain sense, people who are descendants of enslaved people will say that they are, African descendant, but also recognizing the reality that a lot of enslaved people came from the Indian subcontinent and even Southeast Asia. And so the distinction between being a descendant of someone who is indentured and a descendant of an enslaved person, it's not phenotypic so much as it is based upon descent and knowing your origins, if that makes sense. So the idea of origins, if you are indentured, if you say in Mauritius that you are an Indian person, it effectively means that you're capable of tracing your origin to the Indian subcontinent. And a person who is a descendant of an enslaved individual could phenotypically, look like an Indian person, but if you are incapable of tracing your ancestry directly to India, then in the Mauritian context, you wouldn't be considered Indian. That inability to trace origins would be indicative of being a descendant of enslaved people. So I think, it's in a way, it's mapping onto these Eurocentric understandings of enslavement and indenture, but then I think there's also a way that the Mauritian conception of ethnicity identity is unique in certain ways, and it reflects this element of its Indian Ocean history, this diverse cosmopolitan history of people on this island.
Thank you. Okay, so Nidhi. So I'm having to cut my questions down. So this question of indigeneity, how does this fit in with discourse surrounding land dispossession and the politics of recognition in Kenya more broadly?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. In kind of thinking through what's going on with LAPSET, right? There's a way in which we were just recently at a workshop on ports across the Middle East and North Africa. And in thinking about this question around indigeneity in Kenya, right? There's a constant sort of, while on the coast people are kind of fighting back against the state, that is true of everywhere else in Kenya too, right? Where nobody really feels a part of the state, right? This is a constant struggle. But for instance, there have been protections around with the Maasai, who have been very successful at sort of, petitioning the Kenyan state as well as international agencies on the grounds of indigenous rights. And that is seen as a model through which even some of the folks on the coast are attempting to sort of frame their own sort of indigenous place in the state. But at the same time, given the specific history of the coast and its incorporation into Kenya in 1963 and the longer history of it as being sort of a protectorate under the Sultan of Zanzibar and so on, right? There have been sort of these long-standing questions around whether or not, people of the coast are indigenous, and part of it also has to do with a split between sort of Christian and Muslim populations and this longer kind of history of, outside connections, right? So the reason why, Bajunis who had sort of either Arab or Indian ancestry, right, would mention that in certain points and then not mention it in others, because again, it's part of this sort of how do you make a claim that is recognizable in the eyes of the state? It's not necessarily about sort of claiming indigeneity more generally, but how can you make this form legible to the state, right? And this is, again, one thing that, you know, the Maasai have been successful in doing, but the Bajuni are using it as a kind of form through which to present that to the government. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. It's routinely contested, of course, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and Benedito. So, also when we were talking earlier, you also spoke about Navelcar being Goa's most famous unknown artist. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this, because it also speaks to art history and the canon, and yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think the strange thing about Navelcar was never at the right place at the right time. So, you know, colonialism, British colonialism has ended in formerly British India, and the Portuguese Prime Minister gives him a scholarship to leave Portuguese India. He goes to Portugal, and Goa is freed of Portuguese colonialism and becomes part of India, and Vamona gets blacklisted. Vamona then has to move to Mozambique, which becomes free of Portuguese colonialism, and he gets incarcerated. And then he comes back to Portugal, which has just survived the Carnation Revolution. And because of that, he then returns to Goa. So never at the right place at the right time, and so then continues to live out the rest of his life in Goa as a Portuguese citizen. But he always described himself as being an artist of three continents. He would say, I have three mothers. And the problem with this, as beautiful as that might sound, and the influences of these three places shows up in his art in different ways and in different places. So when he was in Mozambique, he was still painting things that were influenced by his time in Portugal. When he was in Portugal, he was painting things that were from his time in Goa. And then when he comes to Goa, he's still drawing and painting Mozambican themes, women, fashion, and so on, right? But because he winds up in post-British India, where he'd spent, he comes to Goa very late in his life. After he spent the bulk of his time, he's lost the majority of his Mozambican collection in the suitcase, right? Indian art historians didn't know where to place him, if they even tried, in the canon, because as India moved inexorably towards the nationalist right, and Goa did as well, Goa's past as part of this Indian Ocean circulation that included Africa and Portugal, the Lusosphere, as I call it, that was slowly moving away as Goa became part of India. And so an artist that dabbled in depicting Fernando Pessoa, a Portuguese poet, or Mozambican head wraps on women, right, doesn't feel very Indian, right? So there's, you know, sadly, how many of you know Portuguese, other than Pamela Gupta? I may put Pamela on the spot. So Vamona would always quote his favorite Portuguese poet, Fernando Pessoa, and he would say, "Eu sou nada, nunca serei nada." Pamela? I am nothing, I will always be nothing. And he would say this not only because he would use Fernando Pessoa as this subject who, in his own lifetime, had never achieved fame. And for Vamona, in deliberately saying this expression in Portuguese while he was in Goa, was to say that, look, I come from a particular generation. I evoke, he knew very well what he evoked. And for him, in saying this, it was not only that he was evoking his Portuguese past, he was also evoking his African past. And knowing fully well that the reason he was nothing and would be nothing was because he was not going to be recognized by the Indian state.
Hi, thank you, all three of you, for such fascinating papers. This question is directed to Nidhi because I'm so enthralled by this idea about mangroves, and it's something I've also kind of been thinking a little bit about. I've encountered some really interesting and strange photographs from Reunion Island of, different, like natives kind of navigating these mangrove forests in boats for like French colonial administrators, which is really strange. But that brings me to something that came up for me in looking at those images, is the fact that kind of both in the Americas and then also in the west coast of Africa, historically mangroves, like mangrove forests, were understood as these sites of kind of like, they're like unnavigable, they're dangerous, they're, as you mentioned in your presentation, like these like sites of pestilence. And so I'm very interested in this idea of mangroves, like mangrove forests as like these unknowable spaces. And I'm curious to know whether because what you brought up was so interesting about like people trying to make their claims to indigeneity legible. But I'm wondering too if some of those claims are also couched in terms of like, this space is ours and it's unknowable. And we, like that is what demarcates us from like people from mainland Kenya. So I don't know if that's something that has come up in your conversations in Lamu.
No, thank you for that. No, absolutely. I mean, while in the colonial imagination or in sort of even the ways in which mangroves get written about often as unnavigable spaces, I mean, in Lamu, they're deeply navigable, right? Like there's long histories of how people actually move in that space and live within that space as well. And so this would continually come up in conversation around sort of like, how can they make policy on mangrove forestation or reforestation when we are the ones who know how it actually works because we have been living with them for so long. And this also had to do with sort of, policies around the ban in the 1980s, but then has come up again with Lapset being built and mangroves actually being destroyed and questions around sort of replanting of mangroves and so on. But one of the sort of, sites of contestation for many of these activists is, again, that in the Kenyan state imaginary, mangroves are unknowable, unharvestable, replantable. In the local imaginary, right, they are not replantable. Once they're destroyed, right? But there's a way to kind of also conserve and preserve through this process of selective cutting that they would talk about. So yes, absolutely tied to this idea of an archipelagic indigeneity, right? Even though it's not framed as archipelagic, but an idea of sort of the mangrove as being knowable to us from the archipelago, but not to mainlanders, absolutely, yeah.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic panel. I have questions for everyone, but I'm just going to stick to one very invested question for Dwight. So love the work, very, very fascinating to think about it from this kind of architectural history of work and living conditions. I'm just curious about where you're situating this intervention, because in the kind of indenture historiography that I'm familiar with, there was the Hugh Tinker indenture as a new system of slavery, right? So that was from the outset, this kind of marrying of, this is just a continuation. And then a lot of pushback in the 2000s against that kind of equation of slavery and indenture for fear of flattening the experiences. So that's from the scholarship perspective. But from the local political perspective, also there was that other move, right? So the reason why Apravasi Ghat has to be a separate thing is because the Mauritian Indians want to claim this unique kind of experience. They are also invested politically in making it a pioneering narrative of enterprise and hard work. And there is a reality of South Asian racism. So, and also a long history of Hindu nationalist kind of mobilization from the 1920s onwards. So I'm wondering, I'm completely with you, and there's a lot of continuities. For example, even, like, I'm interested in the experience of the ship. and it's often the slave ship that gets repurposed and becomes the coolie ship, right? So there's a lot of those real material continuities. But politically, I'm wondering what the...
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think part of it is because historians of Mauritius, so I'm thinking of people like Megan Vaughan, but also Richard Allen, have really cemented this idea in the historiography that effectively slavery and indenture were distinct. And so that, you know, even though it's seen as this new system of slavery, the way that it's been framed is that because an indentured laborer would be someone who was on a contract, it did not apply to a person's child, that effectively that allowed for indentured populations or people whose parents were indentured to gain greater wealth in Mauritius over time. That's the narrative. And, you know, I also think this is a broader issue that I have with a lot of the historiography because, you know, not to, again, bag on one particular scholar, but in Megan Vaughan's book, Creating the Creole Island, she ends by saying something to the effect, the last sentence in the book is something to the effect of, you know, the game of multiculturalism began in mid-19th century Mauritius, and the Creole population would lose. And so it relates to this broader idea in Mauritius of the Malaise Creole, or this notion that people who are descendants of slaves were, in particular, uniquely disadvantaged by this system of enslavement in a way that people who were indentured were not, because of the nature of that system and how it didn't, you know, it didn't pass through the generations in quite the same way. And so I think that this is a narrative that continues to exist within Mauritian society. And I think you're right that, of course, this notion that, okay, Opera Vasigat and the Intercontinental Museum of Slavery must be separate comes out of this notion that this is a divided island and that there are two groups that really have very different investments in this place. But I think that really what I'm trying to do is to really say that rather than approaching Mauritian history in terms of thinking of descendants of enslaved people, descendants of indentured as being two separate groups, that maybe this reality of living conditions can be a way of thinking beyond the divisions that, or even in the context of Mauritius, constitutionally solidified. The Mauritian Constitution recognizes people as Hindu, Muslim, Chinese, and general population, you know. So I think that it's more this popular sentiment on the island today of this distinction that is what we need to really not work against, but also speak to, because I think it speaks to this enduring division that sometimes scholarship can actually reassert, in particularly scholarship that's really done with a focus on the island itself in the way that I'm describing at the end of the paper. So I hope that answers or gets at your question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks to all three of you for a very incredibly rich set of papers. You know, I have question for Dwight and then a half question for Nidhi. So I was thinking, I mean, to both of you, because you talked about ports as well. So at this moment, if you look at ports, for example, this is something which everybody knows, just bringing it back to your attention, and so that my question is more clear, is this new sort of port imagination, if you think about different kinds of struggles around ports. I mean, the new port near Israel is a collaboration between Saudi Arabia and the Adani Group in India. There is a new port which is coming up at the southern tip of India in Vizhinjam, which is led by the Adani Group. There's a new Chinese-owned port across, the strait in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, etc. So the ports also, and ports, as we know now, are in the current times, it's also something which is very well located, linked to the global supply chain, right? I mean, as always, but there are newer and newer industries which are connected to it, etc. So how do we think about ports and because you are also doing an architectural history, the new ports and the labor connected to them, all of this to me also seems like gesturing towards a larger infrastructural sublime, so to speak, right? I mean, there is also, these are not standalone ports, there is also a huge signage, thick signage around them. The kind of media material they mobilize, the architectural imagination, and so on and so forth. So I'm just thinking both of you, through very separate kind of, paths and, materials that you have mobilized in your presentations, how do you think of this kind of transformations and shifts that's happening? I don't know whether I made sense, but it's a long-winding question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it actually reminds me of what you were talking about, because one of the things about the port in Mauritius, the wharf where Upper Vassigat and the Intercontinental Museum of Slavery are located, is that that wharf was actually constructed by enslaved people in the 18th century, but it began to sag really quickly after its construction. And so basically it was rebuilt again and again. And part of the reason is because there was no mangrove that existed there. And so basically on the Swahili coast, there's this history of creating these embankments in the area that you're looking at. And so the usage or the creation of embankments on mangroves created this rooted system that allowed the port to exist for, or to weather the erosion. But in the case of Mauritius, the colonizers decided to build the port there in a place where there was no natural mangrove. And so they had consistent problems with the building sinking and so forth. So, that has been remedied by the post-colonial state insofar as they've rebuilt the port completely. It's now a revitalized shopping district, effectively, with these museums. But I guess I don't know if that gets at your question, that it's a very, in the sense of Mauritius, this really material reality of the landscape. And today, this port is seen as a symbolic space, as being a national space. The Intercontinental Museum of Slavery, Creole activists really lobbied to have the building right there on the port because of its symbolic importance to understanding arrival, landing on the island, the trade in enslaved people. So it does have this strong symbolic but also material importance in the country.
No, thank you for that question, Bindu. One of the sort of, in thinking about these port building projects, whether it's in Lamu, whether it's in India with the Adani group, or whether it's in Haifa, right? All of these things are interconnected in terms of sort of building an infrastructure that can have the seamless logistical kind of function of not interrupting supply chains. We're in the U.A.E. right now. DP World functions on this notion of seamless kind of logistics and so on. But what's interesting about sort of, in thinking about LAPSET, what I was struck by was in some ways this could be anywhere, right, in the Indian Ocean. And I've heard similar narratives in Kutch with Adani's first port in Mundra, right? Similar narratives around land dispossession, questions around sort of, ties to the central government, and also who the port actually serves, right? So in Mombasa, further down the coast, there is this narrative of sort of the port in Mombasa, which is one of the sort of, ports that has sort of long existed to connect sort of interior to the coast, but also, connections to Uganda and so on. But who does the port actually serve, right? And this has been something that has come up over and over again, is that it's not actually built for those who live in the city, but for in order to enable connection elsewhere, right? So this is a point of contestation continually, whereas the older ports, right, and the reason why I ended up working on LAPSET was because I was actually interested in dhows, and the reason why people kept talking about the change in the waterfront was because there was something that had changed
about the sociality of the place, right? Where dhows would come and they would seamlessly kind of move in and out of the town of Lamu and then connections elsewhere. These ports, I mean, most people in Lamu have never been to Lapset, right? And it kind of, we call it like a ghostly presence in Lamu, where it's visible in the distance. It's changed the ways people can move in the region, but people haven't actually been there. There's only also like, in 1 year, there were maybe 3 ships that even got there. So it's kind of like a pie in the sky kind of situation of creating this, you know, seamless logistical network, but it comes at the cost of all of these other things that are similar processes in Haifa and similar processes in Mundra, right, with port building, but also access and sort of access to ports. I mean, if you've ever tried to do research in a port, the number of sort of like permits required to even enter, it's a nightmare. But I think it signals the kind of separation of port and city that is so sort of visible in many of these places, especially in these new port-making projects that are highly surveilled and connections to elsewhere much more important, yeah.
I think I was next, correct? Yeah? All right. Okay, I guess I am. Thank you, that was a wonderful panel. I just wanted to make 3 quick little interventions on each paper, just something to think about, and if we run out of time, we can talk about it later as well. I'll start with Bene. I was just thinking if you could say more on Navelcar's relationship to his lost suitcase, and if that becomes an object of future artworks or some sort of textual relationship with that, and what his entanglement, sort of to use that word, from Rachel is in relationship to that lost suitcase. And then I was thinking about Srinivasa's work on the Remembered Village, where his notes get burnt, and then what he recreates after could be an interesting way to think about what he does in relationship to the suitcase. And then Nidhi, I was thinking about mangroves both in relation to forests, which keeps coming up, but also you mentioned swamps. But as an analytic, what does it do to think about swamps versus forest for mangroves? And then also thinking about sort of, it sounds to me that the mangrove is so sort of politically intertwined with identity politics. So there's a way in which there's a history of human-plant sort of interaction or relationship or networking going on through this history of the mangrove that could be sort of pulled out a little bit more, which I think would be fascinating. And then Dwight, I was just thinking, I can't remember who made the comment about the infancy of sort of, I think it was Bene, about the infancy of thinking about slavery in relationship to Atlantic versus Indian Ocean. And one of the things I know is that the gendered element hasn't been brought into the discussion here, and slavery in the Indian Ocean is very, very different in terms of the gender dynamics versus the Atlantic. And I think that might be a hook in to think through a little bit more about that relationship between indentured labor versus slavery, and exactly as Devashri's comments around the sort of politics of today. I think gender is a huge part of that story that I think really should be brought into this conversation. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Pamela. I have a history of losing suitcases, so I was very drawn to the subject. My graphic novella on Vamona is told from the perspective of the lost suitcase. It's a character in the story. When I curated the exhibition I did of Vamona's, the retrospective, at the end of the curatorial note, I have this vignette from when I first met him. And the question I asked him is, so what happens, which is also the title of the essay, so what happens when you lose everything? And Vamona said, you start over again. So I think everyone else has been fascinated by the lost suitcase, and for Vamona, it's like, okay, this is not going to stop me living my life, basically. But he was also a very clever man. So although, generally speaking, the archive of his Mozambican art is lost, or that period is lost, he would also do these really fascinating things, like and it comes out at the same moment. So I'd also at a different point asked him, what do you think happened to the suitcase? And he said, I don't think it ever made it onto the plane, right? Meaning it wasn't lost en route, somebody took it, right? So because he lived in Mozambique during a period of such high surveillance, right, he would often send back newspapers to Goa. Because when I was looking for work, I wanted to basically have a piece of art from each decade. And the family produced these pieces from the Mozambican period. And I go, how do you have these? And they go, well, Vamona would send back these reams of newspapers back home. And he'd put pieces of art between them to escape censorship. So he knew that his work was, there was always the danger that his work was going to be confiscated and, becomes true in the end because the entire suitcase gets lost. So, yeah, that's how I would think about that question. But yeah, it's, for him, I think, just as with the rest of his life, he was like, this is not going to stop me. Yeah.
Are we out of time? Okay. No, thank you so much for that question around sort of the swamp and the forest, as well as sort of human-plant interactions or ways of theorizing. Yeah, I mean, this is the beginnings of a project around thinking this through, but I think there's ways in which this question of the swamp, right, and the way it kind of figures in the, especially the colonial imaginary, is deeply important, because also people would argue, right, like the Bajunis or mangrove cutters as well as traders would argue that actually the swamp is the most useful kind of formation to work with because it allows for movement at different, as tides change and so on. So I think there's a lot to work with there, and I'll have to think more about it in terms of also sort of thinking through human-plant interactions and what the mangrove as a figure does, but also what the mangrove pole as a resource that's harnessed from that region and how that plays, configures this. Because I think a lot of the writing on mangroves is very much as the mangrove as, a particular ecology, but less as a resource that can be harnessed. In terms of building or so on, especially in this context. So I think I have to tease that out more, but it's very useful. But also your question on gender, right? Absolutely, like how does that figure here? And I wanted to quickly comment on that because, I mean, kind of haunting this entire sort of Bajuni identity question is also a question of matrilineality and how that history kind of also gets subsumed at certain moments, but how are people making claims based on patrilineality or matrilineality, and all of these questions, right? They surface in particular moments around, who's the parent or what the ancestry is. But again, I think in making these political claims, some of these ideas are being sort of subsumed and then used in particular moments. So yeah, more to work with there, but I think it's interesting to think through when these questions come up and when they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thank you for your comments. And I agree with what you're saying. Of course, this is a project that's in its infancy, but I also think one of the things I've thought about in terms of enslavement is how gendered this system of labor is. And basically, in the era of transcultural slavery on Mauritius, right, all of this hard labor, working with basalt, working with coral, it was, the colonizers wanted men to do that kind of work, and generally women come into the construction archive because they were really majorly involved in the supportive industries around construction, so cooking rations for laborers or basket weaving or something like that. But it's interesting how in this era, as indenture is becoming a more major system, this ideology of the gender binary persists, so that hard labor, right, it's still relying on male prisoners very heavily. But yeah, thank you. It's definitely something to consider going forward.